Good evening. Brother Van, I do need to ask you next week, don't tell that I'm preaching next Sunday night. When people find out, they don't show. Yeah. We get a few in number. Interesting topic tonight, but one that a lot of people don't like. We're going to be talking a little bit about budgeting tonight, next week. Next week is going to be the fun session. The second part of budgeting is always fun. But it won't work if you don't get the first part right. And the first part is what most Christians struggle with. Larry Burkett, who I studied under 32 years ago, used to make the statement, number one cause of divorce is finances. Now Larry knew finances. Smart guy. I enjoyed talking to him. I enjoyed working with him. But Larry was wrong. Number one cause of divorce is communication problems. If we can figure out how to communicate, we can solve the other problems. What do we have the hardest time communicating about? Finances. So it was the symptom, not the cause. Well, we're going to be talking finances. You know, it's not easy to talk about. Because everybody has their own idea, their own pet theories, the way they look at finances. But like everything else in life, we need to get into the scriptures. What does God say? How many of you like paying taxes? Anybody enjoy paying taxes? You don't. How many of you don't pay taxes? No, don't raise your hand, that'd be a whole different ballgame. How many of you try to cheat the government? No, we won't talk about that either. But you know, that's an area where a lot of Christians struggle. Well, why should I have to pay taxes when the government uses it for things I don't approve of? Does God approve of us paying taxes? Yes, he does. If you have your scriptures, you can turn to Matthew chapter 22. I'm going to go through a bunch of scriptures so you can keep up with them. Just write them down and look at them later. But Christ is talking. And somebody comes up to him and says, should we pay taxes? Now, the Roman government exacted taxes on the people of Israel. And the people of Israel did not like Rome. Rome were interlopers. They were the foreigners who were trying to tell them how to live. And they didn't like it. They did not approve of what Rome was doing. And so they were hoping that Jesus might say and give them permission to rise up in rebellion and say, well, we don't have to pay taxes. We're Jews. He disappointed them. He says in verse 19, show me the tribute money. Now, if you have any money in your wallet, you can take a look at it. Whose picture's on it? One of the presidents, right? One of the former presidents. And that's what happened with this money. They brought him a penny, a piece of money. And he said unto them, you see this? Whose picture's on it? Who's the inscription? And of course, all Roman money had a picture of Caesar. And he says, it's Caesar's picture, right? That's what they said. And he said to them, therefore, give to Caesar what belongs to him. Now, folks, don't get me wrong. Don't give more in taxes than you have to. There's nothing wrong with taking deductions. There's nothing in the scriptures that says, oh, give everything they want. Use wisdom. Know what's going on. Check the law out. If you don't know how to do your taxes yourself, get somebody that knows how. But don't pay more than you're supposed to pay. But he says, pay what the government is supposed to get. I don't like that. He says, but whose money is it? It's their money. Well, I'm not real sure. Turn to Romans chapter 13. And notice what God says about Rome. Paul was writing the book of Romans during the reign of Nero. Anybody know much about Nero? He was not a nice guy. Matter of fact, it is said that he liked to sit out in his garden at night, lit by Christians who'd been dipped in oil and made into torches. He did not like Christianity. He was out to destroy it. But see what Paul, through God, says. For this cause, pay tribute. Pay your taxes. Notice the next phrase. For they, the government officials, the ones who are trying to destroy Christianity, those who are persecuting you, are God's ministers. Would you like to read that again? Because I don't like it. These people who are trying to destroy our nation, these people who are against Judaism, are God's ministers. I'm not going to get into a political debate tonight. But would the same not be true of our government? Oh, they're not very Christian friendly, are they? Nero wasn't. They persecute Christianity, Nero did. And yet God said they are his ministers. Matter of fact, as you go through the scriptures, quite often God refers to ungodly, anti-Jewish people as being his ministers, his servants. God still has a purpose and a plan. We don't understand it. And we do not have the right to say, but God, I don't think you're doing it right. Because he knows more than we do. And as Christians, we are to give our tribute. We are to pay taxes. Because they're God's ministers. Next time, I will not mention any names, but some of us went to a wedding yesterday in Calhoun. Coming back up I-75, somebody pulled up behind me and said to her husband, "He's speeding." And then a couple of minutes later, she passed me. I don't think I was the only one speeding, okay? If you pass me, you're probably going faster than I am, right? So if a cop pulls you over, do you know you could address them, the officer, as minister? You're going to confuse an officer. "Hello, minister, glad you pulled me over today. What can I do for you?" Yeah, they may take you to the loony bin, but you sit there. God says they're his ministers. They're there for a purpose. And we're to support them. And we're to give. He doesn't say you have to like him. He doesn't say you have to agree with him. But taxes have to be paid. It's part of society. It's the way we survive. Now that was the easy part. Now let's get down to where we really struggle. The second thing in the budget, and these two things are not negotiable. You've got to pay your taxes. But the second thing, tithe. Well, the tithe is under the Old Testament law, and I just don't think we have to tithe today. Well, that's good. What does God say? When did the tithe get established? You may know who Hammurabi was, Babylonian ruler back in 1750 and before BC, before the Old Testament was written. He codified the law. He was not a Christian. He was not Jewish. But you know what he included in the law? Tithe. They had to tithe. And the government would come in and take the tithe. It wasn't a voluntary tithe. It was a, hey, you owe it to us, we're going to take it. So it predates the law. Look at Genesis chapter 14. Lot has been kidnapped, taken away as spoils of war, and Abraham goes to rescue him. On his way back, he runs into somebody by the name of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a type of Christ. He was a symbol. He was the Prince of Salem. Salem means peace. Who's the Prince of Peace? He foreshadowed Christ. And in Hebrews, it talks about Abraham paid tithe to Christ through Melchizedek. Abraham was before the law. So it has nothing to do with legalism. It has nothing to do with going back under the law. But it has to do with something very important. But Melchizedek came out, and Abraham gave him tithes. Why? Who do you tithe to? According to the scriptures, you tithe to somebody greater than you are. And Melchizedek was acting as the king of peace. And Abraham says, I'm going to give you tithe. Why? Because as the king of Salem, he could have demanded it all. He had the right to say, all this belongs to me. And Abraham was recognizing the fact that Melchizedek basically owned it all. He had that authority. And so he says, I'm going to give you a tenth as a testimony that you own it all. Who owns everything? God does, right? And if God owns it all, is it our money in the first place? Whose money is it? How much of what we have, material things, our talents, our abilities, the very breath that we breathe, how much belongs to us? None of it. It's all our Father's. He owns it all. So what is the tithe? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it says the earth is the Lord's and everything that's in it. When we tithe, we're making the statement, everything belongs to Daddy. It's not mine. And if it's not mine, why should I bother mind giving it to him? Why should it bother me? It's his in the first place. He wants us to have that freedom to say, Daddy, you own it all. I'm giving you back a small percentage. Because it's yours anyhow. Hebrews chapter 7, as we just mentioned, Abraham gave through Melchizedek, showing that he was greater. And since God is greater than we are, it behooves us to say, I'll give you 10%. Now, personally, I don't think we should stop there. I think that's just the very beginning, and it should go much further than that. But it's a beginning where we say, you get 10% off the top. Does God want the leftovers, or does he want the beginning, the best? And tithing should come off the top. We should be able to say, I don't know how I'm going to pay anything else, but I know I'm going to pay God first. Because he owns it anyhow. It's his. In Proverbs, Psalms, it talks about, Proverbs, I'm sorry. It talks about if we don't tithe, we put our money in bags with holes in it. See, I have this understanding. God says we're going to give a tithe because it's his. And we can give it willingly, or he's going to take it. And if we're not tithing, God has this way of diminishing what we have anyhow. People who try to live on 100% of what they have struggle more so than people who live on 90%. Because you cannot outgive God. You cannot ever outgive God. God takes care of us. But I don't make much money. Does God say you have to make much money? Who provides for us? Is it not God? Does he have to use money to provide? When I was taking the training with Larry Burkett 32 years ago, there was an event happening back here in Chatsworth. My wife was wanting to give birth to our baby daughter. And I'm in training, and Sheila is trying to go into labor, and I leave a little bit early and get home. Guess how much insurance we had? No insurance. I was teaching at a Christian school. I was making $300 a month. Can't live on that, folks. And to have a baby when we already had a son on $300 a month with no insurance, you can't pay it. But I was brought up from the time I was an infant to tithe. And we tithed. And we get home, and it was an adventure to go to the mailbox because Sheila actually didn't birth Rebecca for another 2 weeks. But we'd go to the mailbox every day. Okay, God, you're going to have to pay for this baby. I mean, you know, you're giving us a blessing, now you got to pay for that blessing, right? Because we don't have the money for it. And we would open the mailbox, and there'd be a check in it from people we knew. But one particular person lived in Wisconsin. Never met him. Have no idea how he found out about us. But he sent us a check for $250 with a note, and it said, God impressed me to send this check to you. We never met him. Have no idea how he knew our address. Have no idea how he knew who we were. No idea how he knew we had a need. So I wrote him a letter back and told him how a blessing it was, and tried to find out something about this guy. Got no response from him. But when we walked out of the hospital, Rebecca was completely paid for. Because God is a faithful God. And you can't outgive him. When we went into the ministry full time, I'm uninsurable. We don't have insurance. Right after we went into the ministry full time, we were struggling, and Sheila needed a complete hysterectomy. Okay, God, you're a faithful God. We're giving to you. We don't have much to give, but we're giving over 10%. We have to depend on you. Anybody know how much a hysterectomy costs? They're not cheap, especially without insurance. So we're sitting in the doctor's office. He's explaining to us what the surgery was going to be like. And then he looked at us and says, I'm finished talking to you as patients. So I stood up. I figured, hey, you're finished talking to me, I'll leave, right? He said, sit down, Daniel. Okay. I sat back down. He says, I want you to know, we know the ministry that you're in. We know y'all don't make much money. We know your physical needs, Matthew's physical needs. I just want you to know our office is not going to charge you a dime for the surgery. We get to the hospital. Because of the Hill-Burton Act, they looked at our income. The lady wasn't real happy with us. She says, well, you should have made plans if you were going to have a baby. Well, we didn't plan to have the baby in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. But the Hill-Burton Act kicked in, and we didn't have to pay a dime for the hospital. We get home from the hospital, and we get a phone call from the anesthesiologist. And he says, I know y'all in the ministry. I know you don't make much money. I just want you to know, we're not charging a dime. The complete hysterectomy cost us $47 for a blood test. That's God, folks. That's the faithfulness of God. He owns it all. And so as we give back to him, acknowledging that he owns it all, he says, you can't outgive me. I'm going to take care of you. But there's another part that is very important to notice. Why do we need to tithe? It's to acknowledge him. But there's something else I want you to notice. And I would love it if you write down these verses so you can check them out later, because it's something extremely important. In James chapter 1, verse 5, if any man needs wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth freely and doesn't fuss about it. How many need wisdom, know how to use the money? Anybody need wisdom on that? Okay, maybe you want to raise your hand and say, I need wisdom. Okay. We need wisdom, don't we? Because we don't know how to make ends meet. Prices keep going up. I mean, come on, folks. Did you know you can't go into the store anymore and buy a nice dress shirt for $4? That's shocking. Yeah. Okay, I mean, this is a $4 shirt, isn't it? Okay, under normal conditions, you cannot do that. It was on sale. But normally, they cost a lot more. It's expensive. Food has gone up. Gas has gone up. Everything has gone up. How are we going to make ends meet? God says, if you need wisdom, ask him. But we don't go about it the right way, because there's a couple more steps we need. Psalm 111, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Does that mean we're supposed to be saying, oh no, God's going to strike me dead, I'm so afraid, I've got to hide? No. That is reverential awe. When we stand in the presence of the Almighty, just wow. Wow. It's unbelievable. But how do we learn how to have reverential awe for God? Because if we need wisdom, we have to learn how to fear God. Where do we learn how to fear God? Here's the key to tithing. Deuteronomy 14:23. Commit that verse, folks, because that is the key. And you shall eat before the Lord thy God in the place where he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of the corn and of the wine and of the oil and the firstlings of the herd and thy flocks. Why do we tithe? The next phrase. That you may learn to fear the Lord thy God always. When we tithe and we see God come through and do more on 90% than we can do on 100%, it leaves us speechless. We stand in awe of God. Wow. It's contrary to the way man thinks. Heaven the Hurting will be 25 years old in March. When we started it, by the grace of God, it was his ministry. And some very wise, godly men, businessmen, ministers, said, you can't do it. You don't know where your money is coming from. You can't do it. It will fail. That was 25 years ago. People are still being helped through the ministry. We still don't know where the money comes from. If you were to look at how much money comes into the ministry and see what God does with it, there's no businessman that can tell you how that works. Because it's not a business. is God's ministry. And we are God's children. And as God's children, he says, don't worry about financial principles. Worry about fearing me. Because it's all about God. And the tithe is about God. It gets our focus off us and puts it on him. And when we focus on him, he has this amazing way of making it work. So folks, as Christians, tithe is not legalism. Tithe is not the law. Tithe is standing in awe of God. And he gives us wisdom. We need to do it. And as a church, if we tithe, the church has the finances it needs. It can reach out to other people. As we tithe, we're doing God's will. And people are being helped. And people are being changed. And people are being brought into the kingdom. But it all starts by doing what God says. Brother Van.